Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Shira. I work for the marketing and events team at Nefesh B'Nefesh, and we are so lucky tonight to be joined by Doug and Batsheva. Doug is the owner of Profile Investment Services that helps people in Israel manage their investments in the United States. And I'm now going to hand it over to them, and they can tell you a little bit more about themselves and the program tonight.
Great, Shira. Thank you very much, and thank you all very much for joining us today. What I'd like to do is to cover a number of the questions that people talk about and that people ask me in my day job as a financial advisor. As Shira mentioned, I work with people who live in Israel who have US investment accounts like brokerage accounts and IRAs. And so a lot of the things that I hear frequently and sometimes daily, I keep track of. And what I'd like to do is to present some of those questions as they kind of fit into the big question of, I made Aliyah, and should my portfolio make Aliyah too? Should I bring my money to Israel? So a few things. During the presentation, there's an option. If you have any questions, there's a Q&A button on the bottom of the screen, not the chat button. The Q&A button is where you can ask any questions. After I go through the initial presentation, I'll be happy to try and answer as many questions as we have time for. The questions should be of a general nature. Don't please give any personal information here. If you do have any more specific and personal questions, you can always email me. My email will be up on the screen, but it's doug@profile-financial.com. You can go to our website, profile-financial.com, or you can simply call the office at 02-624-2788. But as I'm going through things today, feel free to put up questions in the Q&A, and then Batsheva will be the moderator, and after towards the end, we'll try and get through those questions. So let me do this. Let me share my screen with you, and I'm going to turn that on now. Here we go. Okay, so as we said, the initial question is, I made Aliyah, should my investments make Aliyah too? We're going to go through this in terms of certain myths that people have, certain beliefs that people have about their investments or things that they've heard. And a lot of times, a lot of what people have heard, they've either heard directly from their brokers or from their friends. And some of these can be very, very frightening. And I'd like to take some of the fears that people have and see if we can make some of them go away. The first one is that people believe that the brokerage firms are not allowed to open an account or maintain an account for someone who lives overseas. Now, why would people think that? The fact is, a number of brokerage firms in the States over the years, but even recently, have been kicking their clients out. Some of you who may have accounts with Wells Fargo, for example, got what we refer to as the Dear John letter. Merrill Lynch recently, JP Morgan recently, Morgan Stanley also has been getting rid of clients. And so what's happening is that people think, oh my goodness, I'm simply not able to have a brokerage account when I live overseas. And it turns out, and what we'll discover tonight, is that that's just not true. It's not illegal. You're allowed to have the brokerage firm. What it turns out is that a number of these companies simply don't want to do the business overseas. And by the way, I don't think that they're targeting Israel, because we literally get calls from around the world. We've got clients in Europe and the Far East and South America who similarly have gotten letters from their brokerage firm that say to them, listen, you've been a great client of ours for many years, but we're done. So when they get in touch with us, then we're able to explain to them that they don't actually have to take their money out of the United States. And we'll dive into the details in a minute. So that's one of the myths that people have. Another myth is related to their IRA accounts. Now, I'm assuming that people who are listening to this may have worked in the United States, and when they were there, they either had an IRA, which is an individual retirement account, or perhaps they had a 401k or a 403b. These are types of pension plans that are very, very common in the United States. And frequently, when you leave your employer, you take your retirement plan and you roll it into an IRA, and that has a lot of US tax benefits. I'm not talking about Israeli tax benefits, but in the US, people like to keep their money in an IRA account because they don't have to pay tax on it while it's growing. So what happens? So people all of a sudden, they get this letter from their brokerage firm, and the broker says, again, Dear John, you've been a great client of ours, but it's time you take your accounts out. we no longer service overseas clients. So what the clients end up thinking is, oh my gosh, I don't have I don't have a place to put it. So they call up their broker and they say, why don't you just sell out my account and send me a check or wire the money to my Israeli bank? So that is a huge mistake, certainly from a tax point and from I think other angles as well. When you have money inside the IRA, it's protected from US taxes. Again, we're not talking about Israeli taxes, and you should certainly speak to an Israeli accountant. And furthermore, I'm an investment advisor, not a tax advisor. So what you're hearing tonight is not tax advice. Once you take the money out of your IRA, all of a sudden it becomes taxable. Not only that, if you're under 59.5 and you take the money out of the IRA, you're not only going to have to pay tax on what you take out, but you're also going to pay a penalty in most cases. So cashing out your IRA is a huge mistake for people. Instead, what you want to do is you want to move that IRA into another IRA that's handled by a company which is willing to work with clients overseas. That leads to the next point, and then we're going to start talking about the solution to this problem. The next point is that people think that they need to have a US address in order to have a US brokerage account. And so a lot of times what people do is they'll ask their mother-in-law or their cousin or their brother, they'll say, hey, you live in New York or you live in California. Would you mind if I just tell my brokerage firm that I live in your house? And they'll mail the statements there, or at least that'll be the official address on the account. And then they won't know that I'm in Israel, or they won't care that I'm in Israel. And as we say, Shalom al Yisrael, everything will be okay. So this is, I think, where the problems really begin. The first thing you need to realize is that the fact that there are certain brokerage firms that are not willing to work with people who live outside the United States does not mean that all brokerage firms are like that. There are brokerage companies and investment companies like ours, but there are others, we're not the only one, who are what we call cross-border investment advisors. So we specialize in working with people who live in one country and have their assets in a different jurisdiction. And that's normal for us. So therefore, since that's what we do, we're able to put the client's address, his real address, on the statement. We can put that on the account. It's not a problem for us. So you don't need to have a US address on the account. One of the issues that a lot of accountants bring up about this, and I discuss this regularly with accountants, for those of you who are old enough, perhaps you remember there used to be an ad on TV. It was for Trident sugarless gum. And the ad used to say, 4 out of 5 dentists recommend sugarless gum for their patients who chew gum. And so I think of that all the time when I think of the accountants. I say 4 out of 5 accountants that I know tell their clients, don't lie about the address where you live, because what happens? The state, let's say you say, I live in New York or I live in California, you're using someone else's address. All of a sudden, the state thinks that you actually might live there. Why would they think that? Well, because you put that address on a brokerage account. It's a document, it's an official document. You've signed a W-9 form, which is an IRS document that says that's where you live. So reasonably, they assume that's where you live. And all of a sudden, they may get interested in you as someone who they might want to tax. Now, you could argue, well, I don't really owe the tax, it's just technical. Fine. The question is, do you want to argue with the tax authority of New York State or California? Examples, Illinois, right? States that are having huge budgetary problems, are desperate for tax revenue, especially from expats, people like you, because people like us, we're the low-hanging fruit from the tree. We don't really have Congress people who represent us anymore. No one really cares about us in terms of taxes. And so the states, as well as the IRS, of course, see us as people who should just be paying a lot in taxes, and they're happy to go after it. So if you tell them, if you literally write on a document that I live in America, so it's reasonable that they're going to assume that. Who's that 5th accountant, by the way? We said 4 out of 5 accountants tell their clients to tell the truth, that they actually live in Israel. So the 5th guy, you said, no, you can write whatever you want. So I said, why is that? He says, well, because then they have to pay me more in order to fight with the states one day when the state decides to charge them taxes, even though they don't actually live there. And we're going to talk about that 5th accountant a little later tonight as well. Okay, so the myth that you need to have an American account in order to have a US brokerage account is exactly that. It is a myth. you don't need it, and you certainly don't, I certainly would not recommend lying to the brokerage firm or to the bank or wherever you have an account and telling them where you live. By the way, I just want to remind you, if you have questions as we go along, please click on the Q&A button on the bottom and enter your questions. It looks like there's actually a lot of questions coming in. So if we don't have time to answer all of them and your question doesn't get answered, please send me a note afterwards and we'll try to be in touch with as many people as possible to answer their questions. Okay, the next myth about US brokerage accounts is that you won't be able to get a debit card or you won't have easy access to your money. So this is also a myth. And I can tell you from personal experience, because when we set up brokerage accounts for clients, and again, the brokerage accounts that we set up are actually held in the United States. They're US brokerage accounts. It just so happens that I sit here with my team. I'm a US investment advisor. I'm also licensed in Israel, but I'm a US investment advisor. So I'm able to work with people on their US accounts, and we set up US brokerage accounts for them. Part of that is they can get a Visa card or they can get a checkbook so that they have easy access to the money. We don't encourage people to use their investment accounts like bank accounts because you should view them as something different, but certainly it's convenient if you need access to your money, or for example, if you want to write a check and send a check for a birthday present to someone in the States, it's nice to be able to simply write the check and not have to worry that you won't have access to your money. Okay, another myth that people have is that they won't have access to US mutual funds in their accounts. Now, to some extent, this is not totally a myth because certain mutual funds do not allow overseas clients and certain mutual funds do. So for starters, you need to know which is which. Secondly, you need to understand that once again, it's not a question of it being illegal. It is legal for an American who lives, or anyone who lives outside the United States, to own an American mutual fund. But because the regulatory environment for the mutual fund industry is very, very complex, these mutual funds often don't want to deal with anything overseas, so they just draw the line at anything outside the continental or the 50 states, I guess. I suppose they'll accept clients in Alaska and Hawaii as well. So if you found that you have a mutual fund and you can't, they say, oh, you can no longer buy more shares or you can't reinvest or you're interested in the fund and you can't buy it. First of all, it's been my experience that there's usually another fund that you can buy, which is what I would refer to as significantly similar, meaning it's basically going to be the same thing. There are thousands and thousands of mutual funds in the world. There are a lot of exchange traded funds, which often have even lower fees inside of them. So there are great opportunities that people have. You just have to speak to an advisor or shop around and make sure that you find the fund that is available to you, but don't feel all of a sudden, oh my gosh, I'm not able to buy any mutual funds now that I live in Israel. And in a couple of minutes, we will talk about some mutual funds that you absolutely shouldn't buy. But as far as that goes, I don't think you need to get too concerned about owning mutual funds overseas. Okay, another concern then that people are going to have is I'm going to be disconnected from my money. I won't get the statements mailed to me. I tell people in general, I think it's good to get your statements electronically anyway, and most firms will provide that. But certainly, if a company is willing to work with you with a foreign address, then certainly they should be willing to send you your statements by regular mail as well. What we suggest our clients, and in general, I suggest everyone, is because I would say every brokerage firm that I've seen who gives people online access to the portfolio, and I obviously can't speak for every brokerage firm, I can just speak for the way we work, allows you to simply download a PDF of your monthly statement, which is great. And obviously, you should keep an eye on it and look at it on a monthly basis. Don't worry if you don't feel that if it doesn't get mailed in a timely fashion. For that, you might blame the postal service. Okay, so the next myth now is what I referred to before, is about offshore mutual funds. So this is a place where a lot of Americans make a mistake. And actually, the mistake can be terribly, terribly expensive. And I'm going to go back, by the way, to the 4 out of 5 accountants and the 5th accountant that I'll talk to you about as well. So let me just define a few terms. A mutual fund is like a basket. And all the investors put their money in the basket. And then there's a company or a management team who makes a decision how to invest the money. So if it's a stock mutual fund, they'll buy stocks. If it's a bond mutual fund, they'll buy bonds. It could be in currencies or commodities or or a mix of different things. Doesn't matter what it is. It's a basket. You put your money in and you own a little share. You own a proportional share of that mutual fund. This is possibly the most common way that people invest. It's what many, many people are used to. Mutual funds have different terms sometimes. Sometimes they're called mutual funds. Sometimes they're called exchange traded funds, which are a type of mutual fund. Sometimes they're called index funds, which are frequently a type of exchange traded fund. The technical differences of how they trade is not important for our discussion now. What is important is that these are investment companies that are, we would refer to as passive from your standpoint, meaning you're not telling anyone what to buy and sell. You're not saying to the mutual fund, oh, I want you to buy shares of ABC stock and sell shares of XYZ stock. It's passive from your standpoint. And they're investment companies, that's what they do. So now you live in Israel. You walk into your bank and you say, I'd like to invest. I've got, $1 million. How can I invest my money? And they say, well, we'll convert it to shekels and you can buy a keren ne'emanut, which is a mutual fund. So you say a keren ne'emanut, well, that sounds pretty good. That's what I'm used to. I'm used to krenot ne'emanut, right? The mutual fund. So you go ahead and buy one. So what's this actually called? So it is a mutual fund, but it's not an American fund. And the term that the colloquial term is an offshore mutual fund. It's offshore from the United States. As far as the IRS is concerned, the IRS is very, very unhappy when Americans put their money into offshore mutual funds. This probably has a historical reason, because it used to be that people would use offshore mutual funds as a way to evade taxes. I'm not talking about a legitimate tax saving strategy like putting your money in an IRA account, an individual retirement account. I'm talking about hiding your money offshore. So the rules on taxing offshore mutual funds are so extreme that, as I said, 4 out of 5 accountants would tell their American clients, you should not invest in offshore mutual funds. The official term for offshore mutual funds is a PFIC, P-F-I-C. That stands for Passive Foreign Investment Corporation. So it's passive, again, because you're not making the day-to-day decisions, what's going inside. You're just buying a fund that's run by an investment company, and you own a share of it. So it's a passive foreign investment corporation that if you own these, you should right away run to your accountant and ask him or her what you should do. And my guess is that they'll suggest that you should sell the fund. Now, what about the fifth guy? Why did he say that it's okay for his clients to own it? He said, once again, Doug, because if my clients own it, it's much more complicated to file the tax return. There's a lot more billable hours in it for me. So frankly, I think he was being facetious, but the point is, it's just not a place that you want to be going. It's up there with making the mistake of putting money in Israel in large sums of money and then not filing an FBAR. I hope that people out there are aware of FBARs. And again, tonight's discussion is not really about taxes, but I'll just take a quick aside, because if you're not aware of it, then let me bring it up and tell you to ask your accountant. An FBAR is a report of foreign bank accounts, which you're required to file with the IRS. You don't actually pay tax as a result of filing it. It's an informational form that you need to tell the IRS when you have more than $10,000 in accounts outside of the United States, because they want to know about it. So if you don't do it, the penalties are extreme for not filing these forms. And again, you should speak to your accountant. If you haven't done it up till now and you think you've just made a mistake, run, don't walk, and make sure that you clean that up. So it's very, very important that Americans, I'm not talking about non-Americans, don't have offshore mutual funds. Offshore mutual funds are fine as long as you are a non-American. So we have a lot of clients, for example, who are what we refer to as NRAs. And maybe some people out there, if you're American, maybe you're married to an NRA. An NRA stands for non-resident alien. A non-resident alien is someone who, this is, again, an American term, is non-resident in the United States, doesn't live in the United States, and is an alien, is not a US citizen. So someone like that, because that person has no connection with the United States, no problem to buy offshore mutual funds. And frankly, that's exactly what we buy for for our NRA clients, but for US clients, we would never buy an offshore mutual fund. Okay, so another myth that I'd like to dispel is that if you die and you live overseas, your heirs are not going to be able to inherit your estate, or it'll be so complicated that they just may never be able to get the money. So here's where actually it pays to, I think, keep your money in the States where you're used to the system and where your heirs are used to the system. That being said, even when you have money in Israel, and if you have an Israeli will, my experience has been, not from a lawyer's standpoint, because I'm not a lawyer, but from the standpoint of the investment professional, my experience has been that people who live in Israel, if they have an Israeli will and they have a US brokerage account, then as the US brokerage firm, we're able to accept the Israeli will. Now, if you have real estate in America or other assets, then you may need a US will also, but again, speak to your lawyer about that. But really, there don't seem to be huge problems for people who have made Aliyah, who have an Israeli will. I mention this because a lot of times people never really get around to updating their estate documents. And this is a real problem, because obviously you don't want to be one of those cases where you've changed your mind, but you never quite updated your will, or in the case of divorce, where you forget to update your will and then your ex-spouse ends up inheriting the money, or you don't change the beneficiaries of your IRA or of your insurance policies, and the wrong people, the people you don't want, inherit those assets. Obviously, people don't want that to happen. So you need to get your affairs in order. The three main documents that I think everyone needs to speak to their lawyer about is a will, a durable power of attorney, and I'm stressing the word durable here because if you, it used to be in Israel, so if you've been in Israel for a long time and you did a power of attorney, which in Hebrew is called an ipui koach, if you did a power of attorney in the past, it is likely not durable, which means that in the event of your disability, it's not going to continue working. Therefore, very important that you have an updated, durable power of attorney, and you speak to your lawyer about what that means and what that can do for you. You can speak to your broker. What we do for clients all the time is, without a lot of complication, we set up trading authorities, which allows them, let's say that you want to give control over your account to your spouse or to one of your kids for any of a number of reasons. So that's just a simple document that you can do in our office without a lot of problem. And I think all brokerage firms provide that service. And the final document that you want to make sure you don't forget to do is a healthcare proxy. This is where you're going to talk to your lawyer and express what your wishes are in the event that you're not able to speak for yourself and need to make a healthcare decision. So these are the three documents that everyone should work on immediately if you don't have them up to date. And finally, since we're sort of on the morbid topic of inheritances and passing away, I will also note that the Israeli banks have a form you can sign called an arichat yamim, which means that if you have a joint account, for example, with your spouse, and one of you passes away, the account will just continue. It won't freeze. So it's important that hopefully when you open the account, they had you sign that document. But if you're able to check, you should go into your bank and confirm that you have a document on file with them that says that if one of the owners of the account should die, then the other one can continue to use the account. Before we wrap up on this slide, I just want to stress, when a person passes away who has US assets, it's important to take care of a lot of the paperwork first, as soon as possible. I don't mean that day, but within a few weeks, you should already begin getting all the documents that you're going to need ready, all the applications to the IRS for a transfer certificate, which is basically the IRS saying that the person did not owe any taxes. And it's a letter that the brokerage firm or the bank uses in order to release the funds to the heirs. Some of this stuff takes a while, and the longer you wait to get started, the longer it takes to actually deal with the distribution. I have a book called The Inheritance Book, so if you have any questions about it, you can contact the office and get a copy of that, or just, I guess, look it up on Amazon. But it's important to get started with these documents as soon as possible. Okay, next, many people, especially if you've been here a long time, might remember that there was a period when the Israeli banks got petrified about working with American citizens. All of a sudden, they called you in and said, you need to sign a W-9 form or maybe a W-8 form, or they didn't understand what form. And they did this because one of the major banks in Israel wasn't properly reporting to the IRS. Now, you might say, report to the IRS. Why should an Israeli bank have to report to the IRS? Well, that's the power of the IRS. The United States government has tentacles everywhere. And in order for international banks, which many of the Israeli banks are, to do business in the United States, they have to be willing to share information with the IRS. So by the way, for people who think, oh no, they're never going to notice me, the IRS, if I keep my money in Israel, the IRS will forget about me. I'll fall off their radar scope. That's just not true. From what I understand, the IRS and Mas Hachnasa is the Israeli IRS, the two government agencies, it's as if they have a shared database. They can look up anyone and they know exactly what's going on in both countries. So, as they say, you can run, but you can't hide. There's no reason for people to even try, and they shouldn't, obviously. And because of so much sharing of information, it's important to make sure that all your documents are up to date. So the Israeli banks were very afraid because they just didn't know how to comply with all of the US regulations. So for a while, they were actually turning away American customers. They said, no, I'm sorry, you can't open an account, or you can't do any sort of investing with us. Now they're getting a little bit better at it. They're able to do some investing. I still feel that they don't have as much experience in dealing with the international market. So usually I suggest to people that if you're going to be doing Israeli investing, so it makes sense to do it in Israel with people who are professionals in that. And if you'll be investing outside of Israel, so you should work with people who have expertise in the US or other foreign markets. In other words, you want to go to companies and to people where they have expertise that is apropos to your situation. Okay, so next is the concern that a lot of people have, that they won't be able to get access to their money. So first of all, it's sort of true. There's a grain of truth to this, which is because of the Patriot Act, which was what the US passed a law called the Patriot Act, which put a lot of burdens on the banking industry, burdens like what we refer to as KYC and AML, a lot of an alphabet soup here. KYC stands for Know Your Client. So the banks were required and the brokerage firms are required to know who their clients are. They really have to know them. They have to understand who they are, which goes back to why are a lot of American brokerage firms, these major firms, why are they closing down their business? Wells Fargo shut down about $40 billion of client assets. Why would they stop? They just shut it down. They got rid of all that business. JP Morgan, I saw an article a little while ago that they closed 50,000 retail client accounts of people who lived overseas. Why are they doing this? It's because they said, listen, we don't have the ability to do all of the KYC, all of the know your client regulations. And we don't want a problem with that. And it goes along with the AML, which stands for anti-money laundering. You can imagine that you're some compliance officer in Delaware, and all of a sudden you see that someone in the Middle East, yes, that's where we all live, in the Middle East. You see that someone in the Middle East is wiring money. And you say, oh my gosh, the Middle East, isn't that where all the terrorists are? And so you don't want anything to do with that. The law says that if by accident, if they allow someone to wire money for some sort of terrible reason like terrorism or arms, illegal arms dealing, the people who should have noticed the wire but didn't are actually potentially subject to criminal liability. So you can imagine that the compliance officer, let's say at Merrill Lynch, said, what do I want? Why do I personally want to have to potentially go to jail so that we can do business in a country where we don't have enough representatives to even know who the clients are? And anyway, that stuff overseas, who understands that? Those people. So they just don't want anything to do with it. And that's a real reason why I think a lot of companies stop doing business in Israel and outside the United States. So this does have an effect in moving money. Before I tell you some of the problems, I just want to tell you that we wire money for clients all the time from the United States to Israel, because again, we work with people whose accounts are in the US and they bring money to Israel either to cover living expenses or they're buying a house. We've never had a situation where we couldn't wire the money. It just sometimes took a little bit longer. We sometimes needed to provide a little more paperwork or show that who owned the account, and we just had to demonstrate that everything was kosher. So I always stress to people, especially, for example, when you're busy buying a house. When you buy a house, you have certain periods when you have to pay. On December 1st, you owe 2 million shekels. Well, don't call me on November 24th and say, okay, Doug, can you sell my stocks and wire over the money? Plan for this several weeks in advance to make sure that in case there's any hiccup along the way, the money will get there. So it is a myth that you can't transfer your money to Israel. But it might take a little longer than you'd like, especially for larger sums. So just make sure that you allow a little extra time. Okay, so I want to wrap up, and then we're going to jump into the questions. So as we're wrapping up, first of all, if your question, I see we're getting a lot of questions coming in now, and I don't think I'm going to be able to go through all of them. So please feel free to email me or call the office. The number's here on the screen, 02-624-2788, if you need any help with your US investment portfolios. But if you'd like to learn a little bit more about it, you can download a free toolkit that we created at profile-financial.com/toolkit. It gives you just a huge amount of information. It covers a lot of what we spoke about today, a lot of information. We'll also be happy to add you to our mailing list, where you'll learn a lot more about managing a US portfolio when you live here. All right, I think those are the main points that I wanted to make tonight. First of all, thank you again for all joining. I hope if you have any questions which I didn't cover and which I don't cover tonight, you'll feel free to be in touch. And all right, so Batsheva, let me ask you if you can go through some of the questions now, and let's talk about them.
Great, we got a lot of great questions. I just want to remind you that if your question wasn't answered tonight, you could call Doug tomorrow at 02-624-2788. 02-624-2788 and ask him your question then, or you can send him an email at doug@profile-financial.com. So we got several questions about PFIX, and people want to know whether is this literally just an offshore fund, or what about an ETF that was sold through a US brokerage firm that is a licensed American ETF, but holds only Israeli or foreign stocks in the portfolio?
Wow, no, excellent question. Excellent question. I'm going to give you some general answers because there are obviously many different funds, and whatever I'm going to tell you now, you should go back and ask your accountant to review. So there are different ways that the mutual fund companies can structure a portfolio. Simply put, if you own individual stocks in Israel, you go to your Israeli bank and you choose a couple of stocks that you like, that would not count as a PFIC, as a passive foreign investment corporation, because it's something you've actively chosen. You've chosen the stock or you've chosen the bond. It's only when they begin to package them. So the way they package it, for example, an ETF, an exchange traded fund, even though it trades on an exchange, I think that will be a problem for you. Even if they package American stocks inside an Israeli fund, I think that's going to be a problem for you, because once again, the fund itself is going to be registered in Israel. That's the address of the headquarters of the fund, and that's what's going to cause you a problem. And as I mentioned before, to buy specific individual American ETFs, I don't really see the benefit of doing that through your bank here. Again, because you're sort of missing out on the expertise, you're adding another layer of complication to the trade. Whether that itself would be subject as a PFIC, I actually think it might be, and you should check with your accountant. So I'm not gonna tell you for sure. But in any event, I think that, like I said earlier, if you're doing American investing, do that in America. If you're doing Israeli investing, do that in Israel.
Okay, so someone wanted to know about, they sold a house in America and the money is in an American bank. Should they move the money over to their Israeli bank?
I think you got to take a step back and figure out what you need that money for. If you're, for example, buying a new house in Israel and you need the money in Israel, so absolutely, you should right away move it over, convert it to shekels, and get ready to do that new purchase. But let's say that you don't need it for that. Let's say that it's long-term money. And by long-term money, I'll tell you a little house story. I got a call from someone who said, Doug, I sold my house and I have $750,000 and I'd like to invest for the long term. So we had a whole discussion about the stock market and the bond market and planning for the future, but he didn't seem to be relating very well to my questions. And I thought this was a little bit strange. So finally I said, you told me in the beginning this was long-term money. What do you mean by that? And he said, well, I sold my house and I just signed a contract for a new house, but I don't have to make the first payment for 90 days. I said, that is not long-term money. That is short-term money. So when you're looking at a specific sum of money you have in the States, for example, from selling a house, first question is, when are you going to need it? If it's long-term investment money, it might be wise for you to leave it there and then begin to set up a portfolio which is appropriate for you, given your age, your tolerance for risk, and your goals. But if it's shorter-term money, then it might be reasonable to bring it over to Israel. I will remind everyone, if you bring over money to Israel for even a brief period of time that it's in your bank account, let's say you're going to buy a house, say you're buying a house for $1 million. So you bring over the $1 million, it sits in your bank in Israel for a day, and then you pay it to the fella from whom you're buying the house. That means that the highest value of your bank account that year was $1 million. That's something that you absolutely cannot forget to include on your FBAR. That's, again, the report of foreign bank accounts, and that's something you speak to your accountant about it. If you don't do it right, the penalties are horrible.
Good. How about, are there problems when someone with a US IRA dies in Israel? How do you transfer the account to the beneficiary of the IRA who also lives in Israel?
There's a great benefit from the US standpoint, and I'm stressing this from the US standpoint. It's not necessarily from the Israeli standpoint. You certainly should speak to an Israeli accountant, but let's say that you want to enjoy the tax benefit of what's called a stretch IRA or a beneficiary IRA. Basically, the way traditional IRAs work is someone is working in America and every year puts away a few $1,000s into an IRA. That money that they put away is not taxed at the time they put it away. It grows and it's not taxed. And only when the person takes it out at age 72, right? When you get that old, and then you have to start taking some of that, that's when it begins to get taxed. You don't even have to take out the whole thing then. You just have to take out a small percentage every year. Let's say that person dies. Someone in Israel can now set up, and again, this is something we do all the time. Someone in Israel can set up what's called a beneficiary IRA, and we simply transfer the assets that were in the deceased IRA into the beneficiary IRA, and it will retain the American tax benefit for the 10 years that the money is going to stay in that IRA. So it's a technical issue, but make sure you have to do this with an American brokerage firm or an American bank who knows how to do it, and doing it from Israel is the same as setting up an American brokerage account, except you just sign an IRA document instead of a regular account. Thanks.
Great. How about receiving US Social Security? Should it be deposited in an Israeli bank? Can it be deposited in an Israeli bank?
Yes, yes, and yes. I think for a lot of people who are using their Social Security when they, as part of their living expenses, you can actually just tell the Social Security Administration that you want that deposited into your Israeli bank. They deposit it in shekels. I think it usually comes in at a pretty good exchange rate. Then you don't have to think about it. The money's here. I think that's a great tool that not enough people actually use. On the other hand, if let's say you've been living in Israel for a while, you have enough money here, you have pensions here, you don't really need that Social Security for your month-to-month expenses, then you can deposit it into your American bank account or your brokerage account. What we do when we help clients with this is we give them a checkbook, and the number on the bottom of the checkbook is a code that you can tell Social Security, and they'll just directly deposit your Social Security into the investment account. So again, I think if you're going to use the money in Israel, have them deposit it here. And if not, then you can deposit it into your American account.
Great. How about the dropping US dollar rate? There are many people who are concerned about it, and especially if you're going to buy a house in the near future. What should you do to protect the value of your money?
So first off, obviously it's a great question. For those of you who have been here decades, like I have, so you've seen the dollar much stronger, you've seen it weaker. And I'm not going to go through a macroeconomic discussion here, since no one really knows what's going to happen. There are a number of reasons that people present for why the shekel has gotten so strong recently. For example, people think that the exits in the high tech industry, a number of companies have been sold where you and I might exchange $10,000, $20,000 at a time. These companies that are being sold for hundreds of millions of dollars, all of a sudden that money goes to buy shekels. And when you buy something, the value of it goes up. And since currency is a zero-sum game, if you're selling dollars and buying shekels, so that's what's pushing this in one direction. That's one of the reasons people think that maybe the Bank of Israel maybe will raise interest rates. They'd have to raise it a lot for you even to notice that there is any interest, as I'm sure you've seen with the amount of money you're earning on your bank deposits. So any of these reasons could influence the shekel dollar exchange rate. Even just the Bank of Israel, whether they are trying to support the dollar in order to help exporters, whether they're out there buying dollars in the market to push it up, all of these things are political decisions. There are economic factors that get into it. So this is a long answer for why I'm not going to tell you what I think is going to happen, because my prophecy, it turns out, is rather weak. But I think there are some practical measures that people can do. If you know that you're going to need that money in the near term, I think you have to bite the bullet and convert it. So for example, if you know you're going to need another $1 million in shekels, you should really focus on changing that over soon, simply because you don't want to be a currency trader. Whatever price you're going to get is what you're going to get. If you are a long-term investor, however, there are certain tools that you can use. If you're a long-term investor and you want to have a US portfolio, or you have a US portfolio, so I think you can realize, for example, that there are parallel influences that are going on in both currencies. So for example, inflation in the US has been moving up. So people who own inflation-linked bond funds have moved up a lot, and that's commensurate with the drop in the dollar against the shekel. So it's been almost a parity. So again, I'm not recommending any specific investments here. Each person has to make sure that he speaks with his or her own advisor, but inflation-linked bond, stock market has done very well for people who have been able to stomach the risk. So it's going to go back to each person having a customized answer to his or her own question about what currency it's best to be in.
Great. You spoke before about some of the brokerage accounts, American clients being asked to leave if they have overseas addresses. So why is your firm different, and what can you do about that?
The issue, listen, I don't know, and I think the reasons that the brokerage firms have publicly announced why they're kicking out their clients, I'm not sure that's really the reason. One of the major banks that was kicking out their clients over the past several months sent a letter. It just said, we've decided to refocus our business on our domestic clientele. I don't think that's really the reason. I think what the real reason is because they don't have licensed advisors in the countries where they have clients. We do. I am a licensed advisor. I'm licensed in Israel. And in fact, I was one of the first people to be licensed in Israel when Israel started requiring that investment professionals have licenses. So because I'm here, I'm able to oversee, and I can literally sign off on the new account forms and say, I know this client, I verified them, I spoke to them, I checked them, the same way I did when I was working in New York City in the Twin Towers, Zichronam Levracha. The same way that I work with clients there, I work with clients here. So our company, with, as we say, boots on the ground, is able to actually know the clients. And if a client is wiring money, we can look at the client says, I'm wiring money to buy a property. So we say, okay, can you just show us the contract to make sure you're not wiring it for terrorist reasons? And they show it to us in Hebrew and we can read it. It's not a problem. Whereas American companies who don't have representation in Israel are simply not able to do that. And that's I think the main reason is because we're registered to do business here and in America.
Great. How are investments in US brokerage firms taxed in Israel?
Good tax question. I'm guessing that a number of people who are on this call are recent Olim, which means that you moved to Israel, let's say in the past 10 years. So you might still be enjoying your 10-year tax holiday, which Israel currently grants to people, that they don't have to pay tax on some of their investments overseas. But in general, and again, it is a complicated question. The general rule of thumb is that people are paying in Israel 25% on their capital gains, interest, and dividends. Because of the tax treaty, if you pay tax in Israel, in general, you'll be able to take a credit for that in the United States. So for example, in America, if you owed 30%, and in Israel you owed 25%, if you paid it here, you would only pay the extra 5% in America. This is a real oversimplification, but I hope that answers your question.
Great. Is money deposited FDIC insured?
So they're excellent. Boy, we really scored on this webinar. The people are asking the most important questions, I think. And I want to clarify a couple of things. There is FDIC insurance. So when we, for example, buy a CD, a certificate of deposit for a client in America, that's an FDIC insured bank deposit, meaning if the bank goes out of business, you are insured, you'll get back up to $250,000 per depositor. If it's a joint account, it's $500,000 per bank. And when we have clients who have wanted to put millions of dollars into CDs, so we simply buy CDs from multiple banks to make sure that they have 100% FDIC insurance on their portfolio. Israel, by the way, doesn't have FDIC insurance for the banks. The term that a lot of people you hear they speak about is that if a bank should go bankrupt, then the government here has a moral obligation to bail it out. I'm not a big fan of talking about governments and moral in the same sentence, so I don't really know what that means. I don't know, as we say, if you can take that to the bank. But in the US, if you buy CDs, they're FDIC insured. The brokerage account itself is covered by a different insurance called SIPC. But all the accounts that we deal with are always fully insured to the full value of the account. This does not protect you if you buy stocks, for example, and they go down in value. That's no one can insure you against that, well, let's say with normal insurance, but it does protect the actual securities themselves.
Great. I haven't gotten an official letter that I need to close the brokerage account, but I'm worried about getting one. What should I do?
If you haven't gotten the letter yet, I think the fact is, most of our clients were people who never got the letter. They were people who said, I moved to Israel, I didn't get the service that I was used to getting in America. The broker doesn't call me, or I don't think they understand what it means to live in Israel. I wanted to talk about my bituach menalim and my kupot gemel and my karen hishtalmut, and the broker just had no idea. He wasn't able to do financial planning for me anymore. He wasn't able to really give me advice. He didn't understand the banking system here. He had trouble transferring money to Israel. All of these issues that people are confronting are reasons to leave a brokerage firm. I think that if you are entrusting your portfolio, which is, forget the money, I mean, obviously that's important, that's your future and that's your children's future. You worked for it. You deserve to get a level of service which is second to none. And if you're getting great service and you have a fantastic relationship with your advisor in the States, and somehow they're really able to keep up with things here and you see them from time to time, or you talk to them regularly, great. I would never suggest that you should stop a relationship that's working. But more often than not, I found that people feel, the guy, he inherited my account from the previous broker who got it from another guy, and they don't really know who I am. And the clients simply are not feeling, they're just not feeling the love that I think that everyone really deserves when having their portfolio managed. Listen, Batsheva, it's getting late. We've covered a lot. I see that there's still a lot more questions, and I'm very sorry that I think we should call it quits here. Let me once again, if you didn't get your questions answered, feel free to email me. Again, my email address is doug@profile-financial.com. You can go to our website. I encourage everyone to download a copy of the toolkit. Let me just put up that screen once more just so you can see it. And I'm really happy to help out as much as I can. but I just think that we're just about out of time tonight. So thank you all very, very much for joining me, and I hope that this was useful.
Thank you all so much for joining. As Doug mentioned, the best way to contact him is on the screen. We're so happy that you could all be here tonight, and this video will be posted on YouTube within the coming week. Have a great night.